January 3rd, 2026, 4:47 a.m. Caracas time. US Special Forces extract Nicolas Maduro from Miraflores Palace. 72 hours later, he's in a New York courtroom facing narcotics trafficking charges. $60 billion in Chinese investment gone. 300 billion barrels of oil back under American influence. The Monroe Doctrine just got enforced by helicopter gunships. I've analysed regime change operations for 27 years, and what happened in Venezuela isn't about democracy. It's about preventing the world's largest oil reserves from integrating into Chinese currency systems. Let me show you what really happened. For 7 years, Washington tried everything. Sanctions, diplomatic isolation, opposition support, Juan Guaido, declaring himself president. None of it worked. Maduro stayed in power. Venezuelan oil kept flowing to China. Beijing's economic footprint across South America kept expanding. So what changed? Why did military intervention happen January 2026, not 2023 or 2024? Three factors created the operational window. Russia's Ukraine commitment eliminated Venezuelan protection. Moscow has been Maduro's military backer for decades. Russian advisors, Russian weapons, Russian diplomatic cover at the UN. But Russia's resources are fully absorbed in Ukraine. Their capacity to project power into the Western Hemisphere effectively disappeared. The protection Russia once provided simply doesn't exist anymore. China's calculated restraint made intervention low risk. Beijing has $60 billion invested in Venezuelan energy infrastructure, $18 billion in Venezuelan debt. But China's strategic assessment concluded Venezuelan oil wasn't worth direct military confrontation with the United States. China's response was diplomatic protest and economic countermeasures, not military threats. Beijing recognized the hemispheric reality. American military superiority in the Americas is overwhelming. Geographic proximity makes intervention low risk for Washington. Domestic political calculation created the green light. Trump's second-term emphasis on the Monroe Doctrine provided political cover. The framing of hemispheric security against Chinese economic penetration resonated across both parties. The operation's swift success, Maduro captured within 72 hours, minimal American casualties, validated the decision before domestic opposition could organize. These three factors converged. Military intervention became operationally feasible and politically sustainable. The question isn't why it happened. The question is what it reveals about power when diplomatic constraints disappear. Here's what the headlines missed. The strategic value isn't current production. Venezuela's oil output collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s to less than 1 million today. Infrastructure has decayed. Skilled workers fled. The petroleum sector is a shadow of its former capacity. That misses the point entirely. Venezuela's strategic value is future control over 300 billion barrels of proven reserves. That's larger than Saudi Arabia, roughly 18% of global petroleum resources. And under Maduro, those reserves were being integrated into Chinese economic planning through deals that priced oil outside the dollar system. This is where denomination matters more than volume. For 50 years, global oil has been priced in US dollars. This creates automatic demand for American currency. Every country needing oil needs dollars to purchase it. That demand allows the United States to borrow at lower rates, run larger deficits, print money without immediate inflation consequences that would destroy any other economy. But that system is fracturing. Saudi Arabia refused to renew exclusive dollar arrangements. BRICS nations increasingly settle energy trades in local currencies or yuan. Venezuela, according to multiple intelligence assessments, was preparing to fully integrate its energy sector into China's cross-border interbank payment system. Price oil in a basket of currencies led by yuan. If that had succeeded, it would have proven that major oil exporters could price energy outside the dollar system and survive. That precedent would have accelerated the dollar's decline as dominant reserve currency, not immediately, not catastrophically, but structurally over decades. This is why Trump moved when he did. The operation wasn't about removing an authoritarian, it was about preventing Venezuela's 300 billion barrels from becoming proof that dollar-based energy pricing is optional. Trump said this explicitly in his January 4th press conference, though State Department officials walked it back within hours. He said American oil companies would go in, rebuild infrastructure, extract wealth. The oil would flow to other countries and to the United States as, quote, a reimbursement for damages. That language got cleaned up fast. Marco Rubio went on television saying this was about governance, not resources, but the contradiction tells you everything. Trump describes what the operation accomplishes. Rubio manages diplomatic fallout. Reality sits somewhere between you need to understand what's been happening across Latin America for 2 decades. China-Latin America trade hit $518 billion in 2024. That's over $500 billion in commerce. 20 years ago, China accounted for less than 2% of Latin American exports. Today, China is South America's largest trading partner. Brazil trades more with China than with the United States. So does Peru. So does Chile. But trade volume is just the surface. The transformation is infrastructure. China now owns or operates major ports in Peru, Brazil, Panama, Ecuador. The port of Chancay in Peru became operational late 2025. It's designed to handle exports from 6 South American countries directly to Asia. Cuts the United States out entirely. Brazilian soybeans, Chilean copper, Peruvian minerals, all flowing to China through Chinese-controlled infrastructure. 22 out of 33 Latin American and Caribbean nations joined China's Belt and Road Initiative. That's not trade agreements. That's ports, railroads, energy contracts, payment systems operating independently of Western financial architecture. Venezuela was becoming the energy anchor for this system. Chinese companies secured exclusive access to 70% of Venezuela's oil reserves through deals negotiated during Maduro years, not current production, future reserves that won't be exploited for decades. China was locking up energy supplies for the next half-century, while American companies remained shut out by sanctions Washington imposed. This is the context that made intervention necessary from Washington's perspective. The United States was watching its historical sphere of influence shift economically toward Beijing through infrastructure that couldn't be reversed through sanctions or diplomacy. Venezuela represented the energy component that would make China's South American presence sustainable long-term. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's portfolio is Latin America. That's his focus, his expertise. His strategic goal is clear: reassert American economic leverage in the Hemisphere through force when economic pressure fails. The Venezuela operation is the signal. It says if you move too far toward China, if you threaten dollar-based energy pricing, if you become a critical node in Beijing's supply chain, there are consequences. This isn't traditional regime change. This is market rebalancing through military force. Here's the question nobody's answering. Who governs Venezuela now? Trump said the United States would, quote, run the country. Rubio said no. Existing structures handle governance. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez appeared on state television claiming she remains in charge. Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado says Edmundo Gonzalez should assume the presidency under constitutional succession. There's no clarity. That's a massive problem because governance isn't speeches. It's enforcement. Who signs contracts? Who collects revenue? Who controls security forces? Who guarantees legal frameworks for investment? Right now, nobody has answers. Oil companies won't invest billions without knowing who they're negotiating with. International banks won't clear payments without legal clarity about governmental authority. Shipping companies won't move cargo without insurance guarantees requiring recognized governmental structures. 3 possible paths forward. Path 1, controlled transition. The United States brokers a deal between remnants of the existing government and opposition forces. A transitional authority gets established with international recognition. Oil contracts are renegotiated. Revenue flows are restructured toward debt payment and infrastructure rebuilding. Best case scenario requires cooperation from multiple factions who don't trust each other. Years of institution building. Path 2, fragmentation. The government fractures into regional power centers. Some areas controlled by military units loyal to old regime elements, others by opposition groups, others by criminal networks filling the vacuum. Oil production stays disrupted because nobody can guarantee security across the full production chain. Investment doesn't happen. Humanitarian crisis worsens. This is the Iraq-Libya scenario. Military intervention succeeds tactically, but creates governance chaos lasting decades. Path 3, economic counter-pressure. China doesn't accept the outcome. Beijing continues buying Venezuelan oil through shadow tankers and obscure financial channels. China provides economic support to resistance elements. Beijing uses leverage in other Latin American countries to isolate US-backed governance structures. Venezuela becomes long-term economic battleground, where American military control doesn't translate into economic control. The great power competition scenario. None of these paths are clean, none resolve quickly. The Trump administration hasn't articulated which they are pursuing or how they plan to navigate the complexity. High-stakes economic maneuvering without a clear end game. That's dangerous because the easy part, removing a government, is done. The hard part, building a functioning state serving American strategic interests, hasn't started. The most revealing aspect is what didn't happen. International response was muted. Diplomatic protests from expected sources, but no coordinated resistance. No emergency UN Security Council sessions that mattered. No concrete actions changing operational realities. This tells you how power is perceived globally. European governments issued statements expressing, quote, grave concern while doing nothing to complicate the operation. European banks were told to scrutinize Venezuelan transactions, freeze assets linked to Maduro government. This creates financial choke points beyond military action. If you can't clear payments through European banks, you can't settle international contracts. If your assets are frozen in London or Frankfurt, you lose liquidity for operations. Modern economic warfare. The United States provides military pressure. Europe provides financial isolation. Together they create a system where resistance becomes economically unsustainable regardless of military outcomes. Latin American nations faced impossible calculations. Publicly opposing the operation risks American retaliation through tariffs, aid cuts, diplomatic isolation. Publicly supporting it risks domestic political backlash, association with imperialism. Most chose tactical silence, expressing concern about international law while avoiding concrete actions, forcing confrontation with Washington. Brazil, under Lula, issued the strongest opposition statements, but took no actions, actually complicating American operations. Colombian President Petro condemned the intervention, but didn't close Colombian airspace or ports to American military logistics. Mexico expressed concern while maintaining normal diplomatic relations. The regional message is clear: we don't like this, but we won't risk our relationship with the United States to stop it. China's response was calibrated and restrained. Beijing issued strong diplomatic condemnation. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi called the operation, quote, unacceptable violation of sovereignty, demanded, quote, immediate restoration of legitimate government. But China didn't threaten military response or economic retaliation, triggering broader confrontation. This reveals China's strategic assessment. Venezuelan oil wasn't worth direct confrontation with American military power in the Western Hemisphere. Beijing will write off the $60 billion invested in Venezuela as the cost of learning that economic partnerships in the Americas remain vulnerable to American military intervention, regardless of international law or commercial agreements. Russia's response was even more muted because Russia simply lacks capacity to project power into South America while fully committed in Ukraine. Moscow issued perfunctory statements, but everyone understands Russia's protection is no longer operative. The collective international response demonstrates American military dominance in the Western Hemisphere remains unchallenged. Economic integration with China doesn't provide security against American military action. Belt and road infrastructure doesn't come with Chinese military protection. International law doesn't constrain powerful nations when they decide strategic interests require intervention. Here's the connection most analysis misses. Greenland, Panama, Canada, Venezuela. These aren't separate conversations. They're linked by single strategic logic. Consolidating control over Western Hemisphere resources and infrastructure before great power competition escalates further. Consider the pattern emerging in Trump's first weeks back in office. Pressure on Canada over trade and border security. Trump threatened tariffs, questioned viability of current bilateral arrangements. The message, Canadian sovereignty over resources and trade policy, isn't absolute when American strategic interests are involved. Renewed focus on Greenland's mineral resources. Trump discussed purchasing Greenland, securing access to rare earth minerals, and strategic positioning. The framing was economic, but the substance was ensuring Chinese companies don't gain control over resources the United States considers strategically essential. Rhetoric about Panama Canal control and security of critical shipping infrastructure. Trump questioned whether current arrangements adequately protect American interests. The message, trade routes and infrastructure in the Americas operate under American oversight, whether formal treaties acknowledge it or not. And now, military intervention in Venezuela. These moves share common logic. Secure the backyard, control critical supply lines, deny adversaries access to resources and infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere. Before you engage in great power competition with China, you consolidate your region. This isn't new strategy. It's the Monroe Doctrine adapted to 21st century great power competition. In 1823, President Monroe declared European powers attempting to colonize or interfere in the Americas would be viewed as acts of aggression requiring US response. The doctrine worked because American military power in the hemisphere was overwhelming. European powers calculated Western Hemisphere ventures weren't worth war with the United States. Trump's version updates the doctrine for Chinese economic penetration rather than European colonial ambitions. The message to Beijing is identical. The Americas are our sphere of influence. Your economic presence will be tolerated within limits. But when your infrastructure and financial systems threaten to replace American dominance, military force becomes an option. The Venezuela operation demonstrates this isn't empty rhetoric. When economic pressure fails and Chinese integration proceeds anyway, Washington is prepared to use military force to reset the equation. Immediate market reaction was surprisingly muted. Oil prices spiked briefly, then stabilized. Energy stocks gained slightly on expectations of eventual access to Venezuelan reserves. Bond markets absorbed the news without major disruption. This calm tells you markets are pricing in optimistic scenarios that might not materialize. The optimistic scenario assumes Venezuelan oil production returns to 3 million barrels per day over the next decade through American company investment and infrastructure rebuilding. That would add significant supply to global markets. Heavy crude suitable for Gulf Coast refineries priced in dollars under American company control. But that scenario requires political stability and governance clarity that doesn't exist. Rebuilding Venezuelan oil infrastructure takes years and tens of billions of dollars. Requires security allowing foreign workers to operate safely. Requires legal frameworks giving companies confidence their investments won't be seized or challenged. Requires governmental authority that can sign contracts and guarantee enforcement. None of that exists right now. The realistic scenario involves years of governance chaos, disrupted production, competing claims to authority, preventing major investment. Venezuelan oil output stays suppressed, contributing nothing to global supply. The operation achieves its negative goal, preventing Chinese control, but doesn't achieve the positive goal of bringing reserves back under American company production. This matters because financial markets are pricing in the optimistic scenario, while operational realities suggest something much more difficult. When that gap becomes apparent, there will be corrections. Energy stocks that gained on Venezuela expectations will give back gains. Oil prices will adjust upward as it becomes clear Venezuelan supply isn't coming back quickly. For consumers, the promised relief at the gas pump won't materialize. Retail fuel prices lag crude markets by weeks or months. The impact of Venezuela will be minimal near term. The psychological impact might be larger than economic. The perception of energy security and American control over hemispheric resources, creating political benefits even when actual price changes are small. For global energy markets, the bigger implication is about precedent. If the United States can use military force to reset resource control when economic partnerships favor adversaries, what does that mean for other energy exporters? Do trade agreements and contracts mean anything when military force can overwrite them? Questions that will reshape investment decisions and risk calculations across the energy sector for years. Let me bring this back to what matters. The Venezuela operation wasn't about Maduro, it was about preventing 300 billion barrels from becoming fully integrated into Chinese economic planning outside dollar-denominated systems. It was about reasserting control over Western Hemisphere resources before Chinese infrastructure made that control irreversible through economic facts on the ground. Greenland, Panama, Canada, Venezuela, all connected, all part of strategic consolidation of hemispheric resources and trade routes. The Trump administration calls this national security. Critics call it imperialism. But the economic logic is consistent: secure supply lines, control pricing mechanisms, deny competitors access. Whether this strategy succeeds depends on variables nobody can predict. Can Venezuela be stabilized? Will oil companies actually invest billions in a country with no clear governance? How will China respond long term? Can the United States maintain legitimacy in Latin America while using military force to override sovereignty? History suggests caution. Iraq was supposed to stabilize quickly, become a reliable oil supplier. It didn't. Libya was supposed to transition to functional governance, became a failed state. Afghanistan was supposed to demonstrate American-backed governments could provide security and development. 2 decades later, Taliban control the country. Removing governments is tactically easy when you have overwhelming military superiority. Building functioning states serving your strategic interests is extraordinarily difficult. There's no indication the Trump administration has a plan for the hard part. The question is, what happens if this doesn't work? What happens if Venezuela fragments? If oil production stays disrupted for years? If China doubles down on alternative supply chains and other Latin American nations decide partnership with the United States is too risky because sovereignty becomes conditional on alignment? Those questions will determine whether the Venezuela operation was strategic success or expensive demonstration that military dominance doesn't automatically translate into economic control. Right now we're too early to know the answer. What we can say with confidence: The economic contest for South America is no longer background noise. It's front and centre. The stakes are oil, dollars, and the architecture of hemispheric power. The United States just demonstrated that when economic pressure fails to achieve strategic objectives, military force becomes policy. That's the story, not the arrest, not the press conferences. The reshaping of how power operates in the Western Hemisphere when great power competition eliminates the diplomatic space that previously prevented military solutions. 72 hours changed everything. The consequences are just beginning.